This project started back in 2018, and it came through an RFP from the Mineta Transportation Institute and Caltrans. And the proposal was to review the California State Rail Plan and compare it to the content of the other state rail plans that were on record with Federal Railroad Administration as of 2020. Our paper essentially does four things. It outlines the requirements of the FRA's 2013 State Rail Plan guidance. It reviews the California State Rail Plan as well as other rail transit plans. It evaluates the innovative practices of not only California, but of other states, and it identifies improvements for future California rail service plans. Next slide. Next slide. We presented to Caltrans 10 specific recommendations. Those recommendations included establishing matrix to track progress of rail initiatives, most especially with regard to economic progress, mobility, sustainability. One of the things that was quite prominent, not only in California's plan, but in most other state rail plans, is that there was an expression of aspiration, but there was no measure of how that progress should be made, which caused us to come to the conclusion that aspiration is not a plan. The second most important recommendation that we presented was the issue of resilience, prioritizing infrastructure resilience, asset management, and state of good repair. We subsequently modified that to address issues such as pandemics, airborne illness, natural disasters, and hazardous freight. And then the next recommendation was that in the arguments that are made for the development of high-speed rail in the United States, we should look carefully at the arguments that were made for the development of the interstate highway, most specifically the importance of the interstate highway system to our national defense and our ability to better connect the nation from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the southern border to the northern border. Next slide. The fourth matter was with regard to innovative rail funding and financing. Increasingly, FRA and the Department of Transportation are improving the accessibility to various federal funding categories. In fact, I'm right now working with a group that's looking at how states flex their federal highway dollars. And we're finding that there's actually a lot more avenues for grants and other resources than originally was perceived under ARA. But there are still a number of other opportunities out there, including public-private partnerships, private activity bonds, various tax legislation, direct government appropriations that are not being fully utilized. But hopefully, with the passage of the pending infrastructure bill in Congress and the signature of the president, more of that will become more visible, and states and localities be able to take better advantage of the resources that are available. The fifth recommendation was to look at the decision-making framework and tools for future performance. we need to have, as a matter of credibility for the public and for decision makers, we need to have dynamic forecasting with updates for standards of performance. The on-time performance issue is an example of one of them, but there are many, many others, including economic growth, sustainability, technological investment, energy resources, including addressing the greenhouse gas issue. And again, to repeat an earlier note, the resilience of a rail system, especially a high-speed rail system. There are many states, even though PRIA and ARA required the establishment of state advisory boards, there are many states that have not yet done that. And those that have come online recently have proclaimed it as if this was some new innovation, but in fact, the requirement has been in the law for now at least 10 years. And it's hoped that states will move ahead because it's important, again, for the credibility of the projects and for the support of decision makers to have this advisory body, which serves as sort of an objective entity that reviews the plans and programs of the state DOTs as far as the rail program is concerned, and especially in those states where high-speed rail is being proposed or is way, and ensures that the public gets an objective perspective on how things are progressing and what the end goal is. Next slide, please. So in keeping with goal number 6, goal number 7 suggests that the state plans as they exist now are addressed in a 4-year cycle. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of change that goes on over that 4-year cycle. And like most corporate strategic plans and other business plans, annual update, both demonstrating progress as well as suggesting the next level of progress would be very important. Goal number 8 is to ensure active outreach. California, in this case, has done a very excellent and aggressive effort to reach as many communities and as many interests as possible. Some states have had very little of that kind of effort. Some of the states would argue because they were limited in resources to do outreach. Nonetheless, having buy-in from the variety of stakeholders is critical to having a successful and supportable plan going forward. Recommendation number 9, which is something that Rick would like me to dwell into at some length, and I will after we conclude with our 10 recommendations, is to support new initiatives like the Caltrans proposal for integrated transportation. Its California plan is really quite interesting in many aspects, but the fact of the matter is that it recognizes that our transportation system is multimodal, and that in order to have, for example, high-speed rail be successful, you have to have good connections to other forms of transportation, including regular intercity passenger rail, commuter rail, and the local transit system. So we'll get into that a little bit more after I address recommendation number 10. So the last recommendation, and this goes directly to the plate of the FRA and Congress, is that the FRA guidance, which was issued in 2013, really needs to be revised for two reasons. Number one, many states simply looked at the guidance as something they needed to do in order to be eligible to get federal grant money, and so they just simply checked the boxes. But the other aspect of this, something that has been occurring interestingly over the past few years, is that there's a recognition among the states that A, they are part of the corridor, and B, that their systems actually provide connections that not only facilitate regional transportation, but facilitate international transportation. A good example of that is what's happening in the West Coast with regard to the California, Washington, Oregon, British Columbia proposal, and on the East Coast with regard to the from Florida to Canada initiatives. So we're on the verge of really trying to put the U.S. in a position, in a central position, to not only connect our country with our neighbors, but also our country with the world. And the FRA guidance needs to really reflect more of that kind of as we go forward. And it needs to be presented in a way that substantially encourages and provides incentives to the states to think in that form, rather than to just simply think about the confine of their rail systems within their borders. Interestingly, in that regard, all of the states, with the exception of Nebraska and South Dakota, addressed passenger rail. And I presume, although we found nothing substantiated, but I presume that the reason Nebraska and South Dakota didn't address passenger rail is because their rail system is largely dedicated to moving farm commodities, and passenger rail is not priority. So let's go back, if we can, now to recommendation number 9, which addressed the ITP, LITP program. This is, I'm going to go back to 9. California ITP program is very innovative in many ways. But the two most important takeaways from the California ITP initiative are, number one, what I referred to for some time as mobility as a service, a system of payment that is seamless and will enable a transit user to be able to move on a single payment platform from Uber, taxi, rail, bus, commuter rail, intercity passenger rail, and eventually high-speed rail. This was the subject of a workshop that the Intercity Passenger Rail Committee at TRB held now 5 years ago. DJ Mitchell from BNSF and myself organized the workshop, and the whole purpose of that workshop was to get state DOTs and others interested in what was emerging then as a new technology. California has really taken this to a higher level. They've aggressively pursued a one platform system throughout the state, and by way of their 2040 rail plan, they envision that the entire state, as well as many other jurisdictions outside the state, will allow users to be able to use a technology that will be accessible to those who are presently well banked, as well as those who presently are underbanked or have no banking relationship in order to pay for or be allowed to use transportation services. The other aspect of the ITP is that it encourages the development of a system that is now premiered initially in Switzerland, but it has grown. And the intent is to create what is referred to in California terminology as pulse scheduling. By pulse scheduling, I mean that if you are a transportation user and you're going to be making several mode changes, that when you arrive at the destination where you're going to make the mode change, your next mode is there to greet you. And when you get to the next destination and you still require an additional mode, that mode is there to greet you and take you to your destination, thereby reducing the amount of travel time that you require in order to get from your point of origin to your point of destination. In Switzerland, they have developed this to a fine degree, and the individual who is behind all of this is the fellow who's now working in support of the California high-speed rail program. His name is Ulrich Leister, but he's a genius in terms of figuring out the algorithms to how to make a seamless connection possible over multiple modes of transportation. So those are the fine points of the Caltrans ITP initiative, and I hope that it's something that not only will cause users of California's transportation system to benefit greatly, but also will spur, as an example, for other states to follow suit, so that one day in the future, hopefully not as long as 2040, people will be able to board a high-speed train on the West Coast, make whatever connections are necessary, and arrive on the East Coast if that's their ultimate destination, without a lot of delay and without a lot of inconvenience in terms of having to use multiple payment systems or having to have additional knowledge about how the connections work and how the payments work. So those are the fine points of both the research paper that was produced for Caltrans through the Mineta Institute, as well as the fine points of the California ITP initiative. And I would be very happy to take questions or invite additional conversation about either the recommendations that we've presented or the initiatives that I've discussed at some point.
Muted, sorry. Okay, so let's check that the audio is working still. Absolutely, okay. First I want to clarify a couple of things. You mentioned PRIA and ERA.
Yes.
Can you explain what those are, just so that folks who don't know?
Well, PRIA was the Passenger Rail Improvement and Investment Act of 2009, and it provided the authorization that ultimately led to that was done in the George W. Bush. And ERA was the American Reconstruction and Reinvestment Act, which provided in the neighborhood of $7 billion, which at that point was the largest investment that had been made since probably the Transcontinental Railroad back in President Lincoln's period, to the development of passenger rail and the improvement of the nation's rail system. So that was a major injection. The Congress followed on the next appropriation cycle with some additional monies that took total appropriation for rail up to $10 billion. And then when later on the House moved to rescind some of that funding, and so in the end we ended up with about $8 billion through FRA going to the states to build the pipeline for rail improvement.
And then this was something I didn't know. The states were supposed to create advisory boards for passenger rail, or for
under PRIA, the states were required to develop advisory boards for rail transportation. It wasn't specific to either passenger or freight, but it was the requirement that the states develop advisory or put in place advisory boards that would help their state rail agencies in forming the opportunities for growth, as well as evaluating the efforts that were or are going to be made as far as rail.
Did any states do that?
Yes, several states have done it. Most recently, Virginia did it with great acclamation. California has had their advisory board in place for quite some time, and I believe there are about 12 other states. I'd have to look further to see which they are, but slowly but surely they're coming online.
Excellent. Okay,
These are boards that are made up of people who represent interest in transportation, represent interest in community development, economic development, and mobility.
Okay. That is a good thing to know about. The other question that came up pretty quick is, I think you mentioned South Dakota and Nebraska is not having, do they have rail?
Yes, they have rail plans, but in their rail plan, they do not address passenger rail.
Okay.
And minimally, they address the other requirements or desired elements that the FRA saw in their state.
Are those the only states that don't have rail plans?
Those are the only. No, there are several states that don't have current rail, but Nebraska and South Dakota stand out particularly because they do not address passenger rail at all. Okay.
And I would go to Custer State Park a lot more if I could take the train to Rapid City.
Well, when I was growing up in Wyoming, I used to be able to take the train from my little town in eastern Wyoming to Lincoln, Nebraska. It was the Burlington Northern. And at that time, Burlington Northern ran a service from Omaha to Billings, Montana, one day up and return trip at night. But nonetheless, it facilitated my ability to get to school without having an automobile. When the whole system changed in '71, that service was disconnected and no passenger rail service except for a little bit of the corner coming from Omaha south to Denver was continued, but with minimal service for communities in Nebraska.
Okay. Are there any more? Let's see here. Oh, there's two questions here. There's an interesting question here about California perhaps electrifying parts of Metrolink or Coaster. Do you know anything about that potential?
Well, I know that Caltrans and the various joint power authorities very much like to see the entire system. They've gotten some considerable pushback from the freight rails, principally UP and BNSF, but also some of the short lines, out of concern that having an electrified system might somehow interfere with their ability to move their freight on those lines. But as California builds out its high-speed system, and if and when the commuter rails and others can separate themselves, having to rely on the freight rail corridors transit, that's very much desired.
So I frequently point out to folks when they say you can't run double stacks under wires, you can, and they do it in New Jersey on a regular basis, but
Yeah.
it's a little obscure thing over on the East Coast.
No, it's just one of those things that any objection that can be raised to trying to advance intercity and high-speed rail, where the class ones are involved, are going to put up as much objection as possible until the objection is fully addressed.
Yeah.
Fact of life.
And then you brought up the issue of there's a desire to have some clarity here. So you talked about having one fare medium for the entire trip within California.
Right.
And Clipper card is kind of a step in that direction, right? So that is used, you can use Clipper on multiple operators in the Bay Area.
Right.
But it's still separate fares.
Right.
Right.
And the whole notion under the Cal ITP initiative is that there would be a standard formula for fares across the state and across modes, so that you may still be able to use the Clipper card, but the fact of the matter is, it's Clipper card under their paradigm would enable you to use the Clipper card anywhere in the state, and possibly even outside the state once they advance their initiative. So that doesn't make any difference what the card says on the front. It's what the platform is connected to, and is there, excuse me, some consistency among the transit agencies and organizations such that they all recognize a single fare program. They set rates equitably, and they facilitate a customer-facing strategy that does not require a traveler to have to constantly having to buy new fare, buy different fare, or do anything less than putting their card down on the reader when they start the trip and putting their card down on the reader when they end their trip, and having to pay a uniform fare. Or in the case of those who are underbanked or have no banking relationship, being able to use some sort of a state issue or government issue transportation system that provides a subsidy or payment mechanism for those who might otherwise not be able to travel at all.
Okay. I know, I was, we were just starting to get to contactless cards here in Chicago. They were just kind of a concept, right?
Yeah.
And I went to Japan, and I was hosted by JR Central in Japan. And they took us down to Osaka, and the JR Central employees just touched their transit card to get on the high-speed train. I'm like,
Yep.
wait, it completely blew my mind. You could use one card anywhere in the country on
Yep.
any, right? And we hadn't even got that started here yet.
No, and that's the case in many European countries as well. The mobility as a service is almost taken for granted in Europe and in Japan, and I'm sure that there are other, and in Australia. Those are the ones that I'm primarily aware of, but there are others aggressively that format.
And we've been working, one of our kind of, pieces of the puzzle is trying to figure out how to get a single card that works on both Metra, CTA, and Pays here in Chicago, and that's been a slog.
Well, it's all a backroom operation in terms of getting those agreements between the payment systems and a willingness to participate. And the fact of the matter is, quite frankly, that a payment system like that will not only reduce the cost to the transportation agencies, but will ultimately reduce the cost to transportation users, because by having a uniform mechanism, you don't have all of the other issues of auditing receipts, auditing costs, things of that nature. Significantly, at least in terms of California feasibility study on the IT, it significantly reduces the cost of payment, which represents about 15% of the total cost of a transportation journey.
Okay. So Peter wants us to get to more substantive stuff, right? I agree with Peter Laws that the fair media is not the important thing. So I want to bring up, if I can, real quick, the symbol.
Well, I mean, I would take a little bit of exception with Peter's comment, because how transportation organizations generate revenue is the traveler is a very important element in that process.
And well, then that's the point, right? So
exactly.
it's for the users.
If the cost of ridership is so great that people are discouraged and decide to use alternative means of transportation, then it's both the environment and the transportation system that goes out in the process.
Right, I agree. And I've used Metra several times recently, and it's been a challenge because you have to buy your ticket on an app, and that's very difficult sometimes. So I wanted to see if you could comment on this. This to me is the symbol of why the California plan is so revolutionary. And this is for a visual representation of the 2040 timetable,
right,
with each of those squares being the pulse. Can you talk a little bit more about what's behind this map?
Well, the map represents both the evolution or the expected evolution of the rail system in California, including high-speed rail and commuter rail, and the various local transit agencies, including, for example, BART in San Francisco and MTA, I think it's called MTA in Los Angeles. But the map represents the interconnection between all of those various rail modes and how they're going to be able to facilitate transportation throughout the state. The map shows, for example, the expectation of rail line running over, the high-speed rail line running over to Las Vegas. It represents the successful completion of the California high-speed rail system from Los Angeles to Sacramento. And it represents the continued improvement of various other commuter and transit rail systems. And this map actually, when put into the paradigm of a pulse scheduling system, will not only facilitate faster transportation from one end of the state to the other and from one side of the state to the other, but it will also represent the reduced travel time and the incentives to get people out of their automobiles or even out of airplanes to use this this rail system in its variety of forms versus those other modes of transportation.
So kind of getting to the nitty gritty with the single fare media, somebody could get on a bus up here, which is more frequent than it is today.
Right.
They could change to a high-speed train in Sacramento. And that high-speed,
and they would be assured that there's a connection there waiting for them.
And it would be the same time every hour, right?
Yes.
And then, so that high-speed train is running on electrified regional tracks.
Correct.
To Merced, and then it kicks speed up to 200 miles an hour on the high-speed line. And then at Kings Tulare, you could switch to a train that's also designed to meet you there, or the bus that goes out and look at the sequoias.
Right.
And this system would work statewide in a coordinated way.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Correct.
That's pretty cool. And
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any state that started thinking that way.
There's no, we didn't find any other state that has gone to this length or had this level of vision in the development of their rail plans. Now, maybe in the next round of rail planning, we'll see something different. But right now, California stands.
I'm not sure if you cut off or you say California stands.
California stands alone.
Stands alone. Okay, thank you. There was another interesting point that came out of that, and we assembled this from multiple images in the same thing. But so these are all the counties from north to south.
Yep.
And here's the ridership between counties for either train or Amtrak bus.
Right.
And the interesting thing down here is Fresno, compared to many Amtrak stations in the Midwest, Fresno is a pretty busy station. And yet it doesn't show up on this because otherwise over here in 2040, the lines would have to be too thick. This is, if everything goes forward on its own with each agency just pursuing their own agenda, that's the ridership in the middle. But if they do this coordinated pulse system, it's 10 times more than 2010.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And the big thing is this little rural county up here, Butte, all of a sudden now they start to show up as having significant transit ridership.
Yep.
Because the whole system's working better.
Yes.
So our goal, hopefully, is to persuade the rest of the states to start getting to this point of rail plan, and perhaps even doing it across state boundaries, especially here where Chicago is, dependent upon at least 6 or 7 states to make the thing work right.
And just as a sort of a random note aside, I wished when I left Milwaukee last week from the Asheville court meeting that I would have booked the Hiawatha to Chicago as opposed to going to the Milwaukee airport, waiting for the plane, which was actually 4 hours delayed. And I didn't get back to Washington, D.C. until well after 9 o'clock that night. Wherein if I'd been smart enough to take the Hiawatha all the way to Chicago, I probably would have gotten back at my original anticipated time late afternoon.
Or you could have switched to the Capital Limited and been
Or
there.
yes, that's
Well, I guess it's not a morning arrival in DC, though it should be.
no, that would have been a little, yes.
So Bruce Horowitz is asking me to read his comment.
Oh. Hello, Bruce. What's his name?
So he's basically saying that there is still the issue where each of the Bay Areas has their own policies about fares and what's happening with fares, etc. But at least they have the Clipper card so that you can connect between them easily.
That's true. That's one of the challenges that the Caltrans ITP initiative will attempt to address and resolve over the next few years. So that there's an element of uniformity, or at least an element of recognition of those various payment systems. This isn't going to be a let's meet at 1 o'clock and get this filled by 2 sort of issue. It's going to take some significant negotiation. It's going to require input from the community. It's going to require input from a variety of other stakeholders, including labor interests and political decision makers. But the objective is clearly seen.
Yeah. And then I wanted one last piece of this, which, you know, here in Illinois, we've got, where did it go though? We've got a rail plan that has a very long list of projects, including 220-mile-an-hour high-speed rail.
Right.
But it doesn't have any thought about how those are connected or would work better together. No implementation plan. So I wanted to show this other thing right here, which you addressed. But you know, one of the reasons for doing it the way they did, so they created this 2040 timetable so that they can come back and go, well, what do we have to build? They were basically saying that by 2022, that you would already have had to start building it by having it by 2022. But by going to 2040 and working their way back, now they can start thinking about what they have to be designing today to have implemented by 2027, so that they have an implementation plan and they can prioritize things.
Right.
Are you aware of another state that's done something like this?
Well, Virginia, Colorado, Washington, North Carolina, Michigan, they are all they either have all produced a 2040 transportation plan, or they're in the process of developing a 2040 or in that transportation plan. But the interesting aspect of those states that have moved in that direction, and it's an aspect of the FRA guidance that is often overlooked, is that the expectation is that rail will be a part of a state transportation plan that will address all modes. The rail plan is critical to that, but the point is that the rail plan fits in with the highway plan, fits in with the air aviation plan, etc. So that number one, there will be a recognition of all possible projects in the pipeline, proposals that need to be considered for the pipeline. And number two, there's some coordinated decision-making, probably at the State Department of Transportation secretary level or with the governors in determining what the priorities for those projects might be. So this is really a strategic effort on the part of the Congress and successive administrations to be able to identify and recognize the transportation priorities for their respective jurisdictions, and to do it in a way that will hopefully produce the largest bang for the bucks that are invested in, including investment in intercity passenger rail and high-speed rail.
Excellent. And then Jim Kerner, if you can type your comment or question into the chat. I see you put your hand up, but we haven't been able to make getting people's comments live work yet. And then Mary, we do not have any update on the Empire Builder derailment. It'll be a while before that's known publicly. And then there was a large discussion about electrification and hydrogen and batteries. And we know that hydrogen fuel cells work. We know that batteries work. The problem is you cannot scale it to the level you need for high-speed trains. It just is not scalable. At
this point in time.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's not possible, but okay, I'll stick with it because I don't know for sure.
When I was at the Department of Transportation under Secretary Mineta, we started a hydrogen fuel cell project, and our scope was how do we make it feasible for automobiles, and never had a thought about extending that technology to other modes of transportation. I'm excited to see at least the discussion is going on, and that there are, in fact, pilot projects going on across the country regarding the feasibility of using hydrogen to fuel locomotives. Although I did see a Caltrans, either a Canadian Pacific or Canadian National project the other day, where the concern was that you had to have tenders behind the locomotive for the hydrogen, and the issue was how do we protect those tenders from being hit by people who want to encroach on rail right-of-ways with their automobiles.
Yeah, I think there's the missing understanding of just how much energy is in diesel fuel and how little energy is in hydrogen on a quantity basis. And then the other question I have is, who makes the hydrogen and how do you make it? And how much energy do you lose in the process of?
No, actually, yeah. I mean, that's a concern, although I think I'm not clear on this, but I think the production of hydrogen fuel is less expensive and less damaging to the environment than the production of fossil fuels.
Okay. I think, we started late, but we're at the top of the hour. So make one last call. If there's any more questions, we'd be happy to take them. I think that's it. So our website is highspeedrail.us. And if you go to get involved and get some swag, there's some cool stuff you can get there. Or if you want to just make a donation so we can keep doing things like this, and more importantly, get out to local mayors and civic leaders, the need for them to get engaged in pushing for rail, go to highspeedrail.us and make a donation. We appreciate you paying attention. And Eric, thank you very much. This was a very informative presentation.
Well, I hope it was informative, and I hope that people came away with some new awareness or perspectives, and Anything else I can do to help advocate and advance the cause, I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you very much.